Hey everybody! Today we are headed back to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History to check out part of their exhibit on the American presidency, specifically to look at artifacts and information about the various roles that presidents have played throughout the centuries. Let's just jump right into this. The Declaration of Independence acted as a guide to the values that the new government would embrace. Having rebelled against a centralized authority, the first inclination was to place most of the power in the states and to limit national authority by establishing a weak central legislature. However, the realities of building a nation that faced internal dispute and international affairs led many to reconsider the role of the national government and the need for strong executive leadership. Out of this debate emerged the American presidency. As a nation, we place no greater responsibility on any one individual than we do on the president. Could any job be more demanding and complex? We ask the president to be an executive, a diplomat, a military leader, and a consoler. On any given day, he might have to make life and death decisions, propose policies that will change the course of the country, and then greet a group of elementary school children. The greatest chief executives thrive at balancing the numerous roles they are expected to play. Others stumble because they cannot master one of the many duties of office. Under the Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1777 and ratified in 1781, the Second Continental Congress continued its role as the central governing institution. Congress consisted of state representatives and drew its limited powers from the consent of the states. Bills of any significance needed a two-thirds vote, and changes to the articles required unanimous consent. The states maintained a high degree of sovereignty. They coined their own money, raised armies, and erected tariff barriers. Fearful of centralized authority, the former colonists did not create an independent executive branch. The Congress handled administrative responsibilities through committees and departments with appointed superintendents and governing boards. Many felt that the Continental Congress was too weak to resolve problems such as the mounting national debt and conflicts between the states. The Congress reluctantly called for a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. In 1787, every state except Rhode Island sent delegates to Philadelphia. They were mostly well-to-do members of the state's political establishments. The convention met at Independence Hall in Philadelphia from May 25th until September 17th. Fearing that the proceedings would spark public debate, the delegates stationed armed sentinels at the doors and held the sessions in secrecy. In the end, they created a new form of government with 3 branches and checks and balances among them. Only the vaguest notion of the American presidency emerged from the proceedings. Those who followed would have to make this new institution work. After the War for Independence, George Washington was the best known and most respected of all the revolutionary leaders. Elected to preside over the Constitutional Convention, he helped to legitimize the proceedings and encourage the Constitution's acceptance. There was little doubt among the delegates that the office of the presidency they were creating would be filled first by George Washington. His reputation was beyond reproach, and his mere presence during the debates eased the fears of many delegates that a strong executive would naturally evolve into a monarchy. Presidential powers would not have been so great had not many of the members cast their eyes toward General Washington as president and shaped their ideas of the powers to be given to a president by their opinions of his virtue. This is George Washington's portable writing case with compartments for paper, pens, ink, and sealing wax that he used during the Revolutionary War, and also a field telescope purchased by Washington for his personal use during the war. The executive branch began modestly with regular conferences between President Washington and his 4 executive secretaries. These meetings evolved into a standing cabinet, a body not specified in the Constitution. Once established, it became a permanent feature of the executive branch. This engraving is of the first cabinet from a 1787 painting. 2 years after the Philadelphia Convention, the Constitution had been ratified and the Electoral College had unanimously selected George Washington as the country's first president. On April 30th, 1789, Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City and recited the presidential oath of office. This is the only known contemporary engraving depicting Washington's first inauguration. These are commemorative clothing buttons made for George Washington's first inauguration. Participants in the new government knew that they were establishing models for the future, and no one was more conscious of the responsibility than the first president. Always aware of symbolism, George Washington struck a careful balance between acting too regal or too egalitarian. He chose to be addressed simply as Mr. President, yet bowed to guests rather than extending a personal handshake. Most importantly, Washington established the presidency as the central power of the executive branch. He carefully maintained the dominance of the office, never ceding its authority to his cabinet secretaries, never granting its powers to the other branches of government. In creating the appropriate personal style for the presidency, George Washington modeled its social manners and outward trappings after the Southern gentlemanly way of life he had known in Virginia. With no established official residence, Washington outfitted the presidential home in Philadelphia himself with furnishings which were to give the impression of elegance, dignity, and stability. He chose items that were both refined and simple, hoping to strike a balance that would project respect for the office while suggesting the egalitarian principles of the Revolution. This is an 1830 engraving of George Washington's home in High Street, Philadelphia. These are silver-plated candlesticks and a bread basket used by Washington in the presidential mansion, and a Hepplewhite mahogany armchair purchased in 1790 for the presidential mansion. These cabinet portraits of George and Martha Washington were painted around 1793 by John Trumbull and probably presented to them as a gift from the artist. The Washingtons hung the portraits in their bedroom at Mount Vernon. The true test of America's young democracy was not the election of its first president, but rather the transfer of the office to its second, John Adams. Near the end of Washington's second term, he published his famous farewell address, in which he urged all Americans to support the newly formed nation and put aside regional or party divisions. Your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty. The love of the one ought to endear you to the preservation of the other. This bandana was made by W. Gillespie & Company in Scotland in the late 1790s. It depicts a laudatory biographical sketch of Washington with excerpts from his farewell address. According to family tradition, President Washington worked on his farewell address by the light of this brass candelabrum with reflector. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution requires that before presidents can assume their duties, they must take the oath of office. The completion of this 35-word oath ends one presidential term and begins the next. From the day George Washington placed his hand on the Bible and recited the oath, the inaugural ceremonies have been an important symbol of our government's continuity and permanence. The presidential inauguration is a truly American holiday. Every 4 years, amid pomp and ceremony, lofty speeches, and commercialism, we honor our democratic traditions. Inaugurals have an air of dignity befitting a monarch. At the same time, they reflect our down-to-earth feelings about politicians. The ceremonies are partly celebrations and partly coronations. Inaugurals promoted national unity, yet provide an occasion for partisan gloating. They are populist and elitist, public and private, inclusive and exclusive, commercial and civic. But most of all, they reflect the hopes we have for the presidency and our democratic process. Here we are going to look at some artifacts from inaugurations over the years. These will be in no particular order as I just make my way through the display cases. In 18th century America, it seemed reasonable to put 4 months between the election and the inauguration. This would provide enough time to tally votes, to have the Electoral College members send in their ballots, and for the president-elect to organize a new government. But in the modern world of communications and politics, 4 months was an eternity in which crises could arise or the outgoing administration could do untold amounts of mischief. In 1933, the 20th Amendment to the Constitution changed the date of presidential inaugurations from March 4th to January 20th. Starting as a single affair, the inaugural ball has grown into many distinct festivities. In 2005, George Bush hosted 10 official balls. Some balls were exclusive, others were open to anyone who paid admission. Some were formal affairs, whereas at James Polk's $2 balls for pure Democrats, a foreign minister's lady reportedly was seen dancing with her gardener. Jimmy Carter thought ball sounded too formal and called his celebrations parties. While the number of balls has multiplied, there remains an exclusive atmosphere that proclaims that this is a celebration for the newly installed political elite. This overcoat and top hat were worn by Grover Cleveland at his first inauguration on March 4, 1885, which was held on the east portico of the U.S. Capitol. The image of James Buchanan taking the oath of office in 1857 is the oldest known photograph of a presidential inauguration. More than 150,000 people attended his swearing-in ceremony, and there was a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. James Monroe began the tradition of taking the oath of office outside the Capitol in 1817, and since then the public has enthusiastically embraced the opportunity to witness the peaceful transfer of power. The manner in which a new president arrives at the Capitol to take the oath of office and then returns to the White House is decided with great care. Every gesture and decision will be analyzed by the public and the press. The impression made sets the tone for the next 4 years in office. Should the party follow traditions or set a new precedent? Should the carriage be fancy or plain? Should the dress be conservative or fashionable? Should the president ride back to the White House in regal splendor or walk as a man of the people? Ulysses S. Grant purchased this carriage from Meek's Carriage Wagon Repository during his first term in the White House and rode in it to his second inauguration in 1873. Meeks bought back the carriage after Grant left office, and it was used in several parades and historic celebrations before being donated to the Smithsonian in 1968. This photograph is of William and Helen Taft leaving the Capitol to head to the inaugural parade on March 4, 1909. Now we will begin to look at artifacts and photographs related to the many official roles that the President of the United States has to perform, starting with his title of Chief Executive. A president serves as the government's chief administrative officer with the responsibility to see that the laws are faithfully executed. He also appoints various officials with the advice and consent of the Senate. The chief executive heads an enormous bureaucracy that became more complex as the federal government grew and increased its functions. Through the cabinet and through federal agencies, the president has the power to influence virtually every activity of the national government. Governments run on paperwork, and a good deal of it originates at or crosses over the desk of the president. Here is a land grant signed by James Monroe in 1817 and a patent for a washing machine signed by Andrew Jackson in 1833. These artifacts and photographs will be in no particular order, by the way. I am just making my way through each and every case, trying to stay out of other people's way. Here we have an engraving of President Abraham Lincoln's 1862 cabinet by Alexander Hay Ritchie that was taken from a painting by Francis Bicknell Carpenter. Here we have President Dwight D. Eisenhower's reading copy of his 1960 State of the Union address containing notes and last-minute changes. President John F. Kennedy here in the White House Oval Office in 1962. A print by J. Kepler of President Grover Cleveland and his cabinet published in Puck in 1893. President Bill Clinton and Vice President Al Gore witnessing the swearing-in of the 1993 cabinet by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, a paper fan with portraits of President Franklin Roosevelt and his 1893 cabinet, an ivory-handled letter seal that President James K. Polk used in the White House. The size and role of the federal government were so modest in the mid-1800s that during the hot Washington summers, Polk let his cabinet secretaries return home while he ran their departments. He personally answered the mail, filled out forms, signed commissions, and issued purchase orders. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's White House desk plate is here, as well as an onyx and brass pen stand believed to have been used by President Chester A. Arthur, a folder for blank telegram forms used by President Chester A. Arthur, and President Thomas Jefferson's polygraph machine that was made by Hawkins and Peel. Patented by John Isaac Hawkins in 1803, a polygraph's pens create simultaneous copies of a writer's manuscript. Jefferson acquired his first polygraph in 1804 and suggested improvements to Charles Willson Peel, owner of the American Rights. A prolific letter writer, Jefferson called the polygraph the finest invention of the present age. Also here are President Bill Clinton's 2001 federal budget and addendums. The authors of the Constitution envisioned that a president would be above partisan politics. In George Washington, they chose an individual who scorned political parties, calling them potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government. They hoped Washington's successors would emulate his example, but they were wrong. The system they created encouraged, if not demanded, a rise of political parties to articulate and broker differences and required successful presidents to be effective party leaders. For political parties, the presidency is the highest prize. There are coattails to ride into office on, and there is patronage to receive and to disperse. This banner celebrates Franklin D. Roosevelt's 1932 victory and the end of Prohibition. Pundits often say that money is the mother's milk of politics. This is only partly true. The distribution of appointments and favors is one of the most important resources available to a president for strengthening a party and building support for an administration. Even though various civil service reform acts have greatly reduced the number of presidential appointments, there are still plenty of rewards to pass out to loyal supporters or to be withheld as punishment for political disloyalty. This 1909 pen and ink cartoon by Clifford Berryman shows William H. Taft preparing to hand out patronage pies. Several presidents attained office by building political parties or reshaping existing ones. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison organized the Democratic-Republican Party in the 1790s to counter the Federalist Party of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. Andrew Jackson created the New Democratic Party in the 1820s and won the presidency in 1828 by consolidating the remnants of the Democratic-Republican Party and attracting first-time voters. Others, including Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan, reshaped their party's structures, establishing coalitions and bringing in new supporters. This is Thomas Jefferson's snuff box from the early 1800s, Andrew Jackson's plate from around 1828, Franklin Roosevelt's campaign button from 1940, and a Ronald Reagan campaign button from 1984. Abraham Lincoln first ran for office at the age of 23 and spent his life as a political activist and strategist. His skillful touch rallied Republican leaders to the cause of preserving the Union. These original casts made of Lincoln's hands were taken by Leonard Volk on May 20, 1860, 2 days after the Republican Party nominated the former Illinois congressman as its presidential candidate. Lincoln's right hand was still swollen from shaking hands with congratulating supporters. To steady his hand, he held a piece of a broom handle, which is preserved in the artist's cast. Presidents play an important role in strengthening their parties by hosting special events for loyal members and likely prospects. President Dwight Eisenhower greeted guests at this 1954 luncheon sponsored by the Women's Division of the Republican National Committee. Functions like this are typical ways for chief executives to use their valuable time to maintain enthusiastic support for their political parties. From the earliest elections, political parties and local candidates have recognized the importance of linking their campaigns to the head of the party's ticket. This has given the presidential candidates tremendous power to shape their party's agenda and serve as its spokesman. One of the major reasons for calling delegates to Philadelphia in 1787 was to resolve economic problems arising from the Articles of Confederation. We expect our presidents to maintain prosperity, resolve disruptive strikes, and keep employment full and the markets healthy. Even though his power to control the economy is actually quite limited, woe to the chief executive who governs during an economic downturn and is perceived as ineffectual or indifferent. The politician in each president knows what it takes to remain popular. In the words of one political consultant, "It's the economy, stupid." This is a poster from William McKinley's 1896 campaign, a full dinner pail lantern from William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt's 1900 campaign, Herbert Hoover's breadboard from the 1928 campaign, and a button from Bill Clinton's 1992 campaign. The increasing influence of the federal government over the economy has led many Americans to expect the president to maintain the nation's financial health. This includes restraining the price of oil, controlling inflation, and providing a reasonable minimum wage standard. This is a poster from a 1974 truckers' protest in Washington, D.C., a reproduction of a poster from a 1975 job rally in Washington, D.C., a button from President Gerald Ford's 1975 campaign to whip inflation now, and a minimum wage notice from 1974. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, homeless people built ramshackle dwellings on empty lots across the country and named these towns Hooverville, after the president who they felt had abandoned them. This one was in Seattle. Herbert Hoover's failure to aggressively meet the challenge of the 1930s depression ended his political career. Franklin D. Roosevelt's willingness to experiment with untried solutions made him a hero to many Americans for generations. The National Recovery Administration, known as the NRA, created in 1933, was a keystone to Roosevelt's New Deal program. It aimed to set standards for production, prices, and wages in every industry. It specified maximum hours, minimum wages, safety requirements, and the right to unionize. It centralized economic power in the executive branch as never before. Although declared unconstitutional in 1935, the NRA opened the door for ever-increasing federal oversight of the economy. One of the ongoing debates in American history has been the degree to which the government should protect local industries versus encourage free trade. At times, this hotly contested issue has dominated presidential elections. This 1840 cartoon attacks President James K. Polk's advocacy for lower tariffs. Here, President Grover Cleveland is portrayed as a bartender serving a free trade lunch to the workers of the world from Judge in 1888. These buttons are from Washington, D.C. demonstrations in the year 2000. Protesters opposed Bill Clinton's support of World Trade Organization and International Trade Organization monetary fund policies. They accused the organizations of favoring commercial interests over environmental and human rights concerns. In the name of national security or preserving the general welfare, presidents have used their office to settle labor disputes or affect business practices. Both unions and companies have suffered the consequences of presidential wrath. In 1894, President Grover Cleveland ordered federal troops in Chicago to break a strike against the Pullman Palace Car Company that was threatening to disrupt the nationwide rail system. President Theodore Roosevelt led a campaign against the abuses of large monopolies and called for several corporations, including Standard Oil, to be broken up. This cartoon from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch of November 4, 1906, shows Roosevelt aiming a cannon at the Oil Trust. Sewell Avery, president of Montgomery Ward, was removed from his office in 1944 for refusing to comply with the rulings of President Franklin Roosevelt's National War Labor Board. The Army oversaw operations of the company until the end of World War II. These are buttons protesting President Ronald Reagan's firing of members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization in 1981 for violating laws against federal employee strikes. Americans ask their presidents to do more than govern. They expect them to lead. No aspect of the chief executive job is more important than articulating the nation's principles, taking on new challenges, providing comfort, and inspiring in times of crisis, and, in Abraham Lincoln's words, appealing to the better angels of our nature. Presidential leadership has often been met with contentious political debate. But when Americans look back on history, this is the main quality they use to judge a president's tenure in office. This is President Theodore Roosevelt and naturalist John Muir at Glacier Point, Yosemite Valley, California in 1906. After the death of his first wife in 1884, Theodore Roosevelt sought the vast silent spaces of the Dakota Badlands and the recuperative powers of a strenuous life. He purchased a small ranch and reveled in being a cowboy. 3 years later, he was ready to resume his political quest in the East. The experience gave him a love and appreciation of nature that made him a champion of the conservation movement. During his administration, the government transferred 125 million acres of public land into the forest reserves and established 16 national monuments and 51 wildlife refuges. Lyndon B. Johnson became president following the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. Not willing to simply continue Kennedy's reforms, which were largely stalled in Congress, Johnson declared a war on poverty and racial injustice in America. Using his considerable political skills and a good deal of arm twisting, Johnson pushed through the 1964 Civil Rights Act outlawing discrimination in employment, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Civil Rights Act barring discrimination in housing. These were the most significant civil rights laws since the Reconstruction legislation following the Civil War. Johnson used this pen to sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the White House in 1933, confronted by the nation's worst economic depression. About a quarter of the workforce was unemployed and the banking system was collapsing. Overseas, the economic situation contributed to the rise of fascist governments. The pragmatic FDR boldly experimented with the power of the federal government to address these urgent problems. His greatest accomplishment was his ability to inspire and reassure Americans through many dark years as he projected a gallant, even joyous spirit. Although stricken with polio, Roosevelt's condition usually was either disguised or ignored. This original cartoon is from 1933 and is by Clifford Berryman for the Washington Evening Star. Publishers throughout the northern states printed decorative copies of the Emancipation Proclamation celebrating its enactment. This is an engraving published by R.A. Dimmick in 1864. Abraham Lincoln feared that if he pushed too aggressively to end slavery, he would lose popular support for the Union cause. But many Republicans in Congress were urging him to take a stand for freedom. In 1862, under his authority as Commander-in-Chief, Lincoln drafted and issued the Emancipation Proclamation, ordering that on January 1, 1863, all slaves in states still in rebellion would be thenceforward and forever free. The abolition of slavery was now an aim of the Civil War, and with Union victory a virtual certainty. The proclamation's legality was questionable, and the Republican Party dedicated itself to passing a constitutional amendment. On December 6, 1865, the nation ratified the 13th Amendment, outlawing slavery. These are a set of chaps worn by President Theodore Roosevelt on his Dakota Territory ranch from 1884 until 1886. This Columbia Broadcasting System microphone was used for FDR's Fireside Chat radio broadcasts. I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. So began on March 12, 1933, the first of about 30 informal fireside chats that Roosevelt delivered over the radio. His ability to communicate directly and personally through the new medium, addressing each listener as a respected friend, gave FDR a powerful tool to shape public opinion. This is a map of Lewis and Clark's Trail by Bradford and Inskeep in Philadelphia, 1814. In the year 1800, Spain restored the Louisiana Territory to France, and President Thomas Jefferson learned that the territory could be acquired. He believed, however, in a strict interpretation of the Constitution and was troubled that it contained no authorization for the federal government to acquire land. Jefferson faced one of the most difficult questions presidents could ever encounter. When is it right to exceed the authority of the presidency for the good of the country? He resolved that a president must seize an opportunity that advances the nation, and in 1803 approved the Louisiana Purchase for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States. This is a copy of the letter of credit from President Thomas Jefferson authorizing Meriwether Lewis to charge expedition expenses to the federal government. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson organized an expedition headed by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the Mississippi River and routes to the Pacific Ocean. The Louisiana Purchase made the journey even more critical. In the spring of 1804, the Corps of Discovery set out from St. Louis to survey the northwest United States. This pocket compass used by William Clark is one of the few surviving scientific instruments from the expedition. The brass and silver compass set in a mahogany box was made by Thomas Whitney of Philadelphia. By the late 1950s, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union included a competitive and strategic race for dominance in space. The Russians, who successfully launched the first satellite in 1957 and the first manned flight in 1961, appeared to be winning the contest. President John F. Kennedy sought a bold goal that would inspire and excite the American public and ensure its commitment to an expensive space program. Buoyed by the astronaut Alan Shepard's short spaceflight in 1961, the president declared before a joint session of Congress the aim of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. This is John F. Kennedy congratulating Alan Shepard after the astronaut completed America's first manned space mission. President John F. Kennedy said in May of 1961, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. No single space project will be more exciting or more impressive to mankind, or more importantly, none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish." The president is both a national spokesman and a world leader. He is expected to defend America's security and economic interests at home and abroad. As the representative of a country of immigrants with ties around the globe, he is called upon to promote democratic principles and human rights internationally. Several presidents, whose domestic policies were frustrated by an uncooperative Congress, focused their attention on foreign affairs, where their power and freedom to determine policy were less hindered. This is a Washington, D.C. street sign for a state visit. Richard M. Nixon hoped that his administration could ease the strained relations and Cold War tensions between the superpowers. Adopting a policy of détente, he became the first president to go to the Soviet Union in 1972. And that same year, he made his historic visit to China, paving the way for restoration of diplomatic relations after a 25-year break. This is original artwork for a 1954 newspaper cartoon drawn by Ray Evan Jr. for the Columbus Evening Dispatch. Here are the Big Four leaders in Paris in 1919 for the World War I peace treaty talks, left to right. Prime Ministers David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, Georges Clemenceau of France, and President Woodrow Wilson. This is President Ulysses S. Grant and his cabinet greeting a Japanese delegation in the East Room of the White House from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, March 23, 1872. President Woodrow Wilson received a hero's welcome in France. Though much of the World War I peace treaty fell far short of his idealistic goals, he did gain acceptance for his League of Nations and the concept of international peacekeeping. At home, however, isolationism had reasserted itself, and Wilson failed to get Congress to ratify the treaty. His last efforts as president were spent in an unsuccessful attempt to build public and political support for the League. Exhausted from a cross-country tour, he suffered a stroke in September of 1919 and never fully recovered. This is a brooch given by the people of Paris to Edith Wilson, who accompanied her husband to the World War I peace treaty negotiations in 1919. René Lalique designed the pin with glass doves perching on diamond-studded gold laurel sprays. One of the earliest diplomatic issues that presidents faced was establishing and maintaining formal and legal relationships with the Indian nations within the country's declared borders. These presidential peace medals from the Washington, Van Buren, and Garfield administrations were made for presentation to Native American leaders as symbols of diplomatic relations between the U.S. government and Indian nations. The striking of such presentation medals continued until 1889. This is a delegation of Potawatomi, Pawnee, Ponca, and Sac and Fox leaders at the White House in 1857. This beaded pouch was presented to President Ulysses S. Grant during an 1870s Indian Peace Conference in Washington, D.C. This silver ship was presented to President Theodore Roosevelt in 1906 by Empress Dowager Su Si of China. The gift followed China's forced acceptance of an open-door policy for trade with the United States. In the 1980s, the pressure from an increase in U.S. military spending and the change in leadership in the Soviet Union led to a new era of diplomatic relations between the two nations. After a series of meetings, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty on December 8, 1987. It promised to eliminate an entire class of intermediate-range nuclear missiles and was the first arms control agreement to reduce the nuclear arsenal. The success of the negotiations marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Following the treaty signing, Ronald and Nancy Reagan held a White House state dinner for Mikhail and Raisa Gorbachev. This is a White House menu card from the state dinner honoring General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev following the signing of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, December 8, 1987. The use of American presidential influence to settle international disputes has become a significant responsibility. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter hosted peace talks between Prime Minister Menachem Begin of Israel and President Anwar Sadat of Egypt. After almost 2 weeks of negotiations, the three leaders signed peace accords ending the state of war that had existed since 1948 between Israel and Egypt. This folder is from the 1978 Camp David, Maryland summit. This is a picture of President Anwar Sadat President Jimmy Carter and Prime Minister Menachem Begin meeting in the Aspen Cabin patio at Camp David, Maryland on September 6, 1978. President Richard M. Nixon, impressed by the imperial pageantry of European guards, attempted to create a more formal atmosphere for his own state dinners. He had these uniforms designed in 1970 for the White House Secret Service Uniformed Division. While Americans expect a certain degree of formality, they are wary of too much pomp and circumstance. The gold-trimmed tunics and peaked hats struck many as a comical try at emulating the trappings of royalty. The black hat was first to go, replaced by a soft white one. The entire uniform was abandoned in the mid-1970s. These are the new White House Guard uniforms unveiled in 1970 at a welcoming ceremony for British Prime Minister Harold Wilson. This is President Harry S. Truman laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier on November 11, 1947. This is a telegraph key made for President William H. Taft to use in the White House at the opening of the Alaska-Yukon Exposition in 1909. It was used again by President Woodrow Wilson when he opened the Panama Canal in 1913. The marble slab is set with gold nuggets from the Klondike region. This is a silver and ivory trowel presented to President Ulysses S. Grant in 1870 during ceremonies laying the cornerstone of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. As the personification of the nation, presidents are given gifts from appreciative Americans. Warren Harding received this sun watch from the Boy Scouts of America in 1921. William Baker sent these buckskin gloves to Abraham Lincoln on April 11, 1865. They arrived at the White House just days after his assassination. Presidents have used the visibility of the office to advance charitable activities. This has included making the first annual contribution to the Red Cross and kicking off the United Fund Drive with a telecast from the White House. Franklin D. Roosevelt, who contracted polio when he was 39, turned his birthday celebrations into national fundraising events for the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. These evolved into the highly successful March of Dimes campaign to eliminate polio. By combining the ceremonial role of a monarch with the responsibilities of a prime minister, the Constitution created an executive with symbolic as well as administrative duties. As formal head of the nation, the president may solemnly place a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier or festively open a fair. These activities at times seem trivial, but they offer important opportunities for the chief executive to connect with Americans who are the ultimate source of presidential power. John Philip Sousa is in the bottom left-hand side here, directing the United States Marine Band at the White House in 1930, for President Herbert Hoover on the bottom step, British Ambassador Sir Ronald Lindsay, and officials of the Gridiron Club. This is President William H. Taft throwing out a ceremonial first pitch of a baseball game in Washington, D.C. on June 9, 1910. This United States Marine Band cornet was made by R. Wurlitzer and Brothers in 1900. The band was established in 1798 and named the President's Own by Thomas Jefferson. They have provided a regal air to the presidency and the White House for over 200 years. Presidents are responsible for extending the welcome of the United States to its newest citizens. This letter from Gerald R. Ford sends a message of congratulations to newly naturalized Americans. President John Tyler's administration, 1841 to 1845, established the tradition of playing Hail to the Chief as a ceremonial introduction announcing the arrival of the president. The First Lady, Julia Tyler, reportedly instructed the United States Marine Band to play the song whenever her husband made an official appearance. The presidency has been an important part of the country's holiday celebrations. These include Thanksgiving Day proclamations and White House Easter egg rolls. This is the program for the 16th Annual National Christmas Tree Lighting hosted by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on December 24, 1938 in Lafayette Park. This is Marine One taking off from the White House lawn in 1995. These are cards and a score sheet from a game of hearts played on Marine One on its way back from the Wyoming River, Maryland Arab-Israel Peace Conference on October 21, 1998. The game was between Deputy Chief of Staff Marie Eschevets, Press Secretary Joe Lockhart, and Bill Clinton. The armed forces provide transportation support to the chief executive. Both Air Force One and Marine One add a ceremonial aura to the presidential visits. The aircrafts also maintain an essential communications link between the commander-in-chief and the military at all times. This is President George Bush arriving at Palm Harbor, Florida on Air Force One in 1989. The framers of the Constitution wanted to preserve civil authority over the military and designated the President as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. During national crises and war, the power of the presidency has increased to include approval of military tactics, control of the economy, and authority to limit the civil rights of Americans at home. This responsibility has grown dramatically from the time George Washington took up his sword during the Whiskey Rebellion to the day Harry Truman authorized dropping an atomic bomb on Japan. The burden of such awesome power rests heavily on every president. As war swept across the globe in the 1930s, President Franklin Roosevelt refocused his energies and powers of leadership to confront the crisis abroad. On December 8, 1941, the nation formally entered World War II. This photograph shows Roosevelt reviewing American troops in French Morocco in January 1943. This image was first produced for billboards during World War II, but it proved to be so popular that the government printed 4 million copies in this smaller format. This image is of President George Washington reviewing the Western Army at Fort Cumberland, Maryland during the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion. The painting is by Frederick Kemmelmeyer. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Germany, thus entering the United States into World War I. He said, "The world must be made safe for democracy. It is a fearful thing to lead this great, peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars. Civilization itself seems to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts." Here we have probably my favorite artifact in this whole exhibit. This unremarkable briefcase was used during the Clinton administration and is commonly referred to as the football. Carried in the shadow of the president at all times, it contains materials that might be needed in the case of a military emergency. While the Commander-in-Chief is expected to set strategic military goals and approve major tactical decisions, military leaders discourage presidents from meddling in day-to-day operations. Several presidents, however, have felt the urge to command. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, frustrated by the slow advance of General George McClellan's Union forces, personally scouted river landings into Virginia. Lincoln is shown here in 1862 reviewing the troops at Antietam, Maryland. 100 years later, Lyndon B. Johnson selected bombing targets during the Vietnam War's 1964 Rolling Thunder campaign. Here, Johnson is at Cam Ranh Bay with General William Westmoreland in 1966. Most Americans do not welcome the idea of becoming policemen around the globe. But as world leaders, U.S. presidents are taking on more international responsibilities. Following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, President George Bush, through personal diplomacy, brought together a coalition of 30 nations to restore Kuwaiti sovereignty. With the success of Operation Desert Storm, Bush hoped to demonstrate the possibilities for collective security in what he called a new world order. Here is the president sharing Thanksgiving dinner in Saudi Arabia with troops from the U.S. Army 197th Infantry Brigade in November of 1990. Beginning with George Washington, Americans have often chosen military leaders for their presidents. They are viewed as national heroes whose leadership skills have been tested under the pressure of combat and who are prepared to preserve national security. Adding to their appeal, as soldiers, they seem to be above partisan self-interest. Ulysses Grant and Dwight Eisenhower probably would have been elected regardless of their party affiliation. But mastering the political process is key to a successful presidency where persuasion is often more effective than command, even for a hero. Inspired by the political success of Andrew Jackson, in 1840, the Whig Party chose as its presidential candidate General William Henry Harrison, hero of the Western Indian battles and a commander during the War of 1812. The Whig campaign, largely devoid of issues, ran the 68-year-old Harrison solely on his image as a humble military hero. This campaign bandana depicts his victories at the battles of Tippecanoe and the Thames. Harrison easily won the presidency, but he died of pneumonia 1 month after inauguration. This is the summer uniform worn by Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in World War II. By the end of the war, Eisenhower was one of the most popular figures in America. New York City honored him on June 19, 1945, with a victory parade. Although not registered as a member of any political party, he was sought as a presidential candidate by both Republicans and Democrats. Refusing to enter the race in 1948, he was persuaded in 1952 to seek the Republican nomination for the presidency and was swept to victory with the nation declaring, "I like Ike." Ulysses S. Grant's success as commanding general of the U.S. troops in the Civil War propelled him directly into the White House. But his political inexperience led to a difficult administration and a series of scandals. He later commented, "I never wanted to get out of a place as much as I did to get out of the presidency." Grant's status as a national hero was secured when he accepted Confederate General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9, 1865. This towel was used as a flag of truce and saved by George A. Custer, a Union officer present at the surrender signing. Renowned Civil War photographer Matthew Brady took this photograph of Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant at City Point, Virginia, during the Siege of Petersburg in August 1864. This plate is from the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration in 1934. These lighters belonged to Lyndon B. Johnson in 1963, and this is Bill Clinton's matchbook from the year 2000. Here we have a Rutherford B. Hayes invitation from 1881, Dwight D. Eisenhower's Christmas card from 1958, an ink pen that belonged to George H.W. Bush in 1990, and a Harry S. Truman invitation from 1947. This beautiful cup and saucer are from the Ronald Reagan administration in 1981. Although the President of the United States plays many roles, the job is more than a collection of tasks. An office greater than the sum of its parts, the presidency as a whole is symbolized by the seal of the President of the United States. In 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes was the first to use a formal presidential seal or coat of arms with a design based on the Great Seal of the United States. Other presidents followed his example, and the seal appeared on documents, china, and White House decor. It stayed the same until 1945, when Harry S. Truman added stars to represent the states, changed the eagle from white to its natural coloring, and turned the eagle's head towards its right to hold olive branches of peace rather than the arrows of war. The primary purpose of the presidential seal is to authenticate official correspondence from the president to Congress. In addition to its use on documents, the seal, or the presidential coat of arms, which is the seal without the encircling words, is printed on many objects and publicly displayed on a lectern or a table at presidential speeches, bill signings, and press conferences. This large fiberglass seal was used at the White House during the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. It was retired when the White House Communications Agency began using smaller seals for speeches and signing events. Man, I will be so shocked if there's even one person still watching this video, still sticking with me through this enormous display at the Smithsonian on the various roles that American presidents perform and the hundreds of artifacts they have to correspond to each role. This is the kind of stuff I just dork out over, and I was really excited to share this video even though I'm pretty sure this doesn't interest most people. We have officially seen it all in this part of the exhibit. There are a few more parts about life in the White House that I may come back and share at another date, but for now I think this video has gotten long enough. I hope you've enjoyed taking a closer look at the many hats that the President wears: Commander-in-Chief, Chief Diplomat, Economic Leader, and so many more. It's easy to think of the presidency as a single role, but walking through this exhibit really showed me how complex and far-reaching the job truly is. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you another day in another adventure.